From Community Public Radio, this is the CPR News. From New York, I'm Don DeBar. Today we go down to Esteli in Nicaragua to speak with our friend Stephen Sefton. He's a journalist that lives there and has lived there for quite some time. He's going to give us the things happening in Latin America, Central and South America, and the Caribbean from his vantage point in Nicaragua. And Stephen, welcome.
Thanks very much, Don. Thanks for inviting me again.
It's our pleasure.
As usual, there's far too much to talk about, but perhaps something that may be useful to kind of frame it. Perhaps we can talk about the Southcom and then their new chief, Laura Richardson, and her remarks made on March 8th, I think, in front of a Senate committee.
Yeah.
About their priorities in the region. Maybe we can talk about that later.
Right.
But something that I did want to remark on is that there people often talk about in the region in very simplistic ways and kind of reduce things to kind of catchphrases that are very handy for journalists. And by the way, I think of myself more as a reporter than as a journalist, because I think journalism has gone downhill in a practically irretrievable way over the last 20 years. So I prefer talking about reporting than about journalism. But I know that's maybe that's a discussion for another time. But anyway, many news outlets do is they reduce discussions of. They simplify discussions of what's happening in the Latin American and Caribbean region by talking about phenomenon like the pink tide or the conservative restoration. And I've always explained to you and our listeners that I regard this as completely unhelpful, because I think those phrases have practically zero explanatory power. And when you look at the broader movements that are happening across the region, and we can come to this later on when we look at what Laura Richardson had to say to the Senate, and you're talking about really quite profound conflicts. And we can some of the things that we can talk about will illustrate those conflicts. And for example, and we mentioned in a couple of conversations ago, one of the main policy contests in the region, probably the fundamental key policy contest in the region, is between policies promoting productive investment that create wealth for the societies of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, and a kind of exploitative, extractive kind of looting that has been, unfortunately, Latin America and the lot of Latin America and the Caribbean over the last 200, 300 years. First at the hands of the Spanish and the Portuguese and the British and the Dutch, and subsequently at the hands of the United States and also the former colonial powers too. But that continues to be one of the main contests going on in the region. And then also, you have this fundamental conflict between the indigenous and Afro-descendant resistance to the colonial powers and the efforts of the white white majority, or sorry, the white minority in the region to cling on to power, come what may, and with the support of, and they've always that white elite that has always served as the proxies for the imperialist powers of North America and Europe.
Right.
And so it seems to me that those are a much more important kind of axes to grasp in order to understand what's happening in the region. And practically everything that is happening in the contemporary history of Latin America and the Caribbean can be much better understood by looking at those long-standing components of events in Latin America and the Caribbean. So To illustrate that, and one of the things that we might look at is the continuing situation in Colombia of murders of social leaders that is continuing. And finally, it seems to have reached the attention of the United Nations Security Council, who are going to supposedly have a meeting to discuss the catastrophic human rights and humanitarian situation in Colombia. And people often forget that Colombia is a country with a huge population of displaced people, well over 4 or 5 million people. I was surprised, I shouldn't have been surprised, to see a report that around 70% of those displaced people are actually Afro-descendant and indigenous. And that, and what does that mean? And what that means is that that's just a continuing example of the way Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples are the people who suffer most from the neo-colonial policies in a country like Colombia that is practically occupied militarily by the United States. The United States has, I can't remember if it's 7 or 8 military bases in Colombia, and they use Colombia as their kind of base to project military power in the region, in particular against Venezuela. And so there's some hope now that in the elections, the presidential elections coming up on May the 29th, that the progressive candidate, a strong social democrat candidate called Gustavo Petro, is going to do well, and he and his running mate are currently well ahead in the opinion polls. And his running mate, he chose as his running mate, and I think this is very symbolic and important. He chose as his running mate a woman called Francia Marquez, who is an Afro-descendant woman. She's a very well-known lawyer, very active on human rights and environmental issues. And she is going to run with Petro on the progressive ticket of the Pacto Histórico movement. And it looks likely that they are going to do very well in the elections. Most people expect Petro and Marquez to win. So why is that important? In the Colombian context, it's important because Afro-descendant people make up almost 10 million of Colombia's 51 million population. And so the fact that what I understand for the first time, there's an Afro-descendant candidate, especially a female Afro-descendant candidate, on a presidential ticket, and they are likely to win. And that seems to me absolutely fundamental to in terms of realizing the possible change that may take place in Colombia should they go ahead and win, as most people think they will. And then another aspect of that same issue is currently taking place in Bolivia.
Before we go there, can I just ask you, they had the parliamentary election in Colombia last month. And
that's right.
Yeah, I'm curious, how did, for example, how did Petro and Marquez party do?
Well, and I think they're from different parties. But their coalition, the Pacto Histórico, did exceptionally well in the Colombian context.
Oh, good.
And so, and they got, I've forgotten what percentage of the vote they got. I think they got an unprecedented number of deputies in the lower house, and they also did quite well in the Senate.
Oh, I see. They got 27 in the chamber and 20 in the Senate. They came in first. But the numbers are distributed. These are not majorities. I'm just curious, like what kind of a government, if these two win, what kind of government they're going to be heading? Like what's underneath them is difficult to tell because there's like 5 parties. Well, there's 7 parties that all had from 10 to 14% more or less in the Senate, and in the House there's three parties in double digits. From the historic pact had 16 and change, liberals 14 and change, conservative 12 and change, and then you had Democratic Center, Party of Unity, Radical Change, and Green Alliance between 6 and 9% each one.
Yeah, and overall,
Yeah.
and it's still not a bad result for the right wing,
Right.
because and if they're able to overcome their sectarian and personal differences, they should still be able to block legislation proposed by a future Petro government that they don't like.
Right.
But that's by no means certain. And if you look at the way the right wing in Venezuela has been completely unable to combine effectively to challenge the dominance of the PSUV and the government of Nicolas Maduro, and it seems unlikely that the Colombian right is going to combine in a more effective way, and we'll just have to wait and see. Yeah. And Colombia is such an extraordinary country in terms of the polarization. And also quite similar to Venezuela in many ways, but what they lack is a party like the United Venezuelan Socialist Party that is strong enough to unify with its allies and maintain the ascendance of the Bolivarian Revolution against the divided right-wing opposition in Venezuela. So then, we'll see what happens in Colombia. But following up on that theme of, because it seems to me that Francia Marquez's candidacy as vice president, running with Petro, that is such a radical change. And one of the reasons it's such a radical change is that it represents a very strong symbol of Afro-descendant and indigenous resistance that has been just an absolutely permanent feature of the struggle against imperialism and the struggle against colonialism and the struggle against the intervention of the United States, over the last century or so. And you can that's such a common theme practically throughout the region. And if you look at Bolivia currently, the trial is continuing now of Jeanine Áñez, who was the leader of the coup regime that took power after the coup against Evo Morales in 2019. And that trial is under the judicial authority of a Bolivian set of state powers that are largely controlled by indigenous people, by the MAS party, and so the trial of Jeanine Áñez, in a context in which the indigenous peoples have political predominance or control, is also very, very symbolic of the change in the region that has taken place certainly over the last 20 years, whereby the voice of indigenous people and the resistance of indigenous people has become much more forthright and much more successful. And it seems to me that's an important axis to grasp in order to understand events in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so, for example, and if you look at it from a different point of view, if you look at the victory of Gabriel Boric in Chile, and one of the things that Boric is going to have to address is, and he may, but I'm very skeptical about his program, because he's a social democrat, and my view of social democrats is that they'll just hold the fort until they're ready to open the door again for the right wing, so as to stop genuinely progressive, genuinely radical, genuinely revolutionary forces taking power in their country, in this case Chile. And so there are four things really that we'll be able to judge Boric on whether he's genuinely progressive or not. One is reform of the grotesquely repressive fascist Carabinieri police force in Chile. The second thing will be reform of education, which is grossly unfair to disadvantaged low-income families who make up a substantial part of Chilean society. Pension reform, to make pension reform more just on behalf of Chile's pensioners who do not get a fair deal under the privatized pension scheme that was promoted way back. I've forgotten when it was instigated, but it's run by private pension companies for the benefit of the wealthy elite, and they do not genuinely represent the needs of Chile's pensioners. So that's a third thing. A fourth thing is Boric going to address the issue of in the Mapuche people's indigenous rights, which has been a kind of glaring sore in Chile's history ever since, again, this white minority imposed itself on indigenous people's territories, stole their land, and over the last, for as long as I can remember, the Mapuche people in both Chile and Argentina have been struggling to resist continuing depredations of their land and attempting to recover that land that has been stolen from them for over a century, progressively. Now, if Boric addresses those four things and does something and engages in serious reform, which he should be able to because he won by a good margin, if he does, then he will be fulfilling the hopes that so many progressive people placed in him. But I suspect that is not going to happen. But we'll see. And that issue, for me, that is a litmus test of whether Boric is a genuinely progressive or just another social democrat holding the fort to protect the interests of the right wing over the overwhelmingly white right wing elites in his country.
I wonder we had 50 years ago practically now with Allende. The U.S. engineered the truckers' strikes, all the things that were the manifestation of making the economy scream. That culminated in, I like to put it, Allende committing suicide with two machine guns from 50 feet behind him or whatever, but to his death. Do you think Boric hears echoes of Allende's cry?
Yeah, and I think that's true, Don. I think that's self-evidently true. And I regard Boric as a younger male version of Michelle Bachelet. And Michelle Bachelet herself was a victim of the Pinochet regime. But despite that, and she was a very solid centre-right social democrat politician, very strongly sympathetic to the interests of the United States.
Even now, at the United Nations, even now, she's piling on Russia over Ukraine, and she might as well work for the State Department at the UN.
Well, yeah, sure, absolutely, and just as she did against Nicaragua and Venezuela.
That's right, that's correct.
Just the same. So, in Boric's case, sorry, in Boric's case, you can get a gauge of where he's going. He recently visited, you can get a gauge of what his likely loyalties are going to be. Following his recent visit to Argentina. And during that visit, he had a very warm welcome from Alberto Fernandez, the Argentinian president. And I just thought it was very, very interesting that around the time of his visit, and in fact, I think it was immediately after his visit, both Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay, they all voted to suspend Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Council.
Right.
I know that that's a very symbolic kind of vote, you know, and may not have real world consequences at all for Russia.
Right.
But I just thought it was very interesting that all those countries, the Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, and Chile, voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. And then this morning, I don't know if you saw the report, but the TASS news agency reported that Argentina and Chile have agreed to suspend lithium shipments to Russia.
Yeah, I did see that, yeah.
And so, you know, so what's going on there? And that's the United States putting pressure on these countries. Argentina, that they've got impaled on an IMF spike, with massive debt obligations to the IMF that in effect give the IMF control over Argentina's domestic economic policy. And then you have this guy Boric, who's very clearly the kind of, as it were, son of Bachelet, and he too is adopting an anti-Russia position. Now, and to be fair to Boric, he has taken some measures, domestic measures, that look as though he may understand the importance of not alienating his political base. And for example, he's announced plans to reactivate the small business economy in Chile by offering government support, which is something that you'd never have got under his predecessor, Sebastián Piñera. Right. But you know, and that is also an expression of the other thing that certainly from my part I regard as absolutely fundamental to the way events go, which is the contest between and politicians and political movements promoting productive investments have used his political and economic control. So, and there's that contest going on, and it seems to me that I think this brings us to Laura Richardson is in a very, very strong, assertive way fires matters of especial concern in the region, the growing Chinese influence in the region, and they talk specifically about massive.
Let me just explain to listeners. Southcom is the sub of the U.S. military. In other words, the United States has the world divided up into different commands, different zones, and this particular is called Southcom, or the Southern Command, and what we're talking about Southcom.
Right. So actually, one of the things that she said in her remarks to the Senate on March 8th last, coordinate much more closely with AFRICOM, was to coordinate control of the Atlantic region between Latin America and Africa. And that's something that she said very explicitly. And so, but I'm going back to her remarks about a matter of concern to the United States, the fact that China has invested, I've forgotten what the figure is, I think it's $72 billion in the projects that she mentioned, which included a big highway project, Cuba, various projects, infrastructure projects across the rest of the continent. And she pointed out that USAIDs or I've forgotten which institution she mentioned, their contribution was something like 720 million. I mean, you know, and a ridiculously, you know, an amount that doesn't even bear comparison with the investment that China is making in the region. And so, you know, but that to me to be a measure of the extent to which United States and European interest in Latin America and the Caribbean has been purely extracted. They do not invest a significant way in developing the potential for wealth creation for the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. They just don't do it. And they've never done it. They've always engaged in what you call looting, and quite rightly,
Right.
you know.
I think if you look at this, just to interrupt for one second. I mean, in essence, what we have here is a history of the United States and of the UK, Spain, France, the Netherlands. Who the hell ever? Belgium. They didn't have much over here.
French Guyana.
And also Germany. Also, real relationships with people here that began with Columbus and still continues. And in essence, the economy were only allowed to develop. The only investment were things that assisted in the extraction of resources and value from the region. So you would get road lines to the ports to carry nearby, just close enough to be able to go to work and subsist for 20 or 30 years till they drop dead, and hopefully they've reproduced enough so there's 2 or 3 other workers, waiting in the wings to take their place. No development, no advancement really permitted. These things were required. The cities, Caracas and Venezuela, all these different, they were allowed to develop. And so that happened. But in essence, a parasitic look of this region existed. China coming in with a powerful economy and offering a quite different relationship. That the slogan was win-win, but it's an alternative to that. And the same Africa and the United States response, the military sees its job as to thwart China as an alternative to enable the continued extraction of value from these shows the phenomenon we're talking about.
Oh yeah, I know. And Laura Richardson tries to put lipstick on the pig of U.S. neocolonial looting, and by talking about the importance of increasing development support in the region. But that's and they always do. They periodically. John F. Kennedy came up with, what was it, the Alliance for Progress.
Yeah,
and they periodically come out with these kind of
more lipstick, right?
It's just lipstick on their monstrous behavior.
Well, we got about a minute and a half. I'm sorry, Stephen. I just noticed that, so we got to kind of wrap it up. You want to take?
And just very quickly, and so one of the things that is another expression of what we're talking about is the fact that Venezuela has successfully resisted U.S. sanctions, so-called sanctions. They're unilateral coercive measures, completely illegal. And Credit Suisse, the big international financial outfit, has just brought out a report projecting that Venezuela will have 20% growth this year.
Isn't that amazing?
They've got inflation down to under 2% a month,
That's pretty
which
good.
is absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah.
And they've just handed over the 4 millionth home.
4 million homes. They
for
built 4 million
low-income
homes.
families.
Yep. With all those sanctions, they built 4 million homes in a country with a population of about 30 million, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And on the 20th anniversary of the coup against Hugo Chavez, which also bears out what I was saying about, and Hugo Chavez was a man of color, and the reason that the Venezuelan elites hated him was because they're white supremacists.
Stephen, thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Don. Looking forward to talking to you next time.
The same, thanks.
And that's all the news we have for you right now. For Community Public Radio, I'm Don DeBar in New York. Thanks for listening.